And aside from what leaders are doing abroad, Americans here at home are also beginning to take action on this issue. In fact, tomorrow, October 26th, thousands of civil liberty advocates are expected to take to the streets of Washington, D.C. to tell the U.S. government to stop infringing on their right to privacy. The rally is called Stop Watching Us, with the name as simple as the demand. In addition to calling for a halt to the extensive monitoring of American communications, demonstrators will be calling on the government to, quote, reveal the full extent of the NSA spying program. It's garnered a lot of support from both former whistleblowers and celebrities who are taking the opportunity to call attention to the issue. Take a look.
History tells us we need to watch the watchers.
And in the surveillance state, democracy itself is dead.
It makes a mockery of our system of government, which is based on the notion of independent branches of government, including a fourth estate, the press.
A free society should not have secret laws.
It doesn't have to present this false trade-off between security or privacy.
We need to bring NSA activity from the shadows into the light of day.
We need to end mass, suspicionless surveillance.
And all the way from Russia, former government contractor Edward Snowden has weighed in on the gathering. In a rare statement, Snowden said, "Today, no telephone in America makes a call without leaving a record with the NSA. Our representatives in Congress tell us this is not surveillance. They're wrong. Now it's time for the government to learn from us." On Saturday, join us in sending the message, stop watching us. Well, here to talk about what to expect from this rally and the potential for a path forward, I'm joined by Shahid Buttar, Executive Director of the Bill of Rights Defense Committee. Shahid, thank you so much for joining me. So this is being billed as the largest rally to date against NSA surveillance. Do you think this could be the real impetus to change, and what kind of change are you really looking to come out of this?
I certainly think it can be, and among the changes that the Stop Watching Us Coalition is looking for are legislative measures to rein in the NSA, restore constitutional rights, and change the statutory landscape enabled by the Patriot Act and the 2008 FISA amendments.
Sure. Speaking of the Patriot Act, October 26th is actually the 12th anniversary of the signing of the Act. For people that don't understand, how are the powers that were granted during the Patriot Act different from what we're seeing, the authority the NSA now has?
So the Section 215 of the Patriot Act has proven particularly controversial. It was the section at work in the first of the court orders that Glenn Greenwald released from the Snowden documents. And the author of the Patriot Act, James Sensenbrenner, is a Republican from Wisconsin, and he talked about how he engineered that authority to be an investigative authority, that the NSA could particularly zoom in on people who they had suspicion of wrongdoing. What he's particularly concerned about, as are the rest of us, is its emergence and transformation into a bulk collection authority that in a single order has been used to justify the surveillance of millions of Americans at once.
Wow. Well, in response to the release of all of this information, NSA Director Keith Alexander actually called out the role of journalists. Let's take a listen to what he said.
The reporters who got this see this data and quickly run to the wrong conclusion. I think it's wrong that newspaper reporters have all these documents, 50,000 whatever they have, and are selling them and giving them out as if these, it just doesn't make sense. We ought to come up with a way of stopping it.
So he's suggesting that journalists are selling these documents and that the publication, of course, is harmful to the United States. What's your response to that?
I've certainly heard no confirmations of journalists selling information, and Snowden himself has repudiated claims that he has released information that he obtained to foreign governments. And I would just say it's preposterous to think that transparency has hurt anyone here. If there's anything hurting anyone, it is the NSA's activities. And to hide behind the secrecy that's enabled those abuses to continue themselves is cowardly, quite frankly, in a democracy. And if these programs are as important to national security as they claim, and are in fact compliant with the Constitution, which they are not, they should survive the light of day. And it's long overdue for Congress to have a transparent debate about whether or not we want to live in a country with pervasive surveillance, or instead we actually mean it when we sing anthems at baseball games about living in the land of the free.
Indeed. Well, this past July, we saw the Amash Amendment really take root, where congressmen from both sides of the aisle really came together, came to a consensus on this issue. And even though the amendment lost, you could argue that it definitely started to build some momentum. What kind of coalition would you say is building? How would you describe how politicians are rising up to really work across the aisle.
There's a dramatic realignment here. I actually just published an article about this today, where the partisan division that we saw at work in the government shutdown is really being eclipsed by a different line of division between establishment and populist across both of the parties. The Amash Amendment to the House Defense Appropriations Bill is a perfect example. That vote split each of the major parties, and the Speaker of the House Minority Leader, and the President were arrayed against the combined forces of the progressive left, anti-war Democrats, and the libertarian right, Tea Party-influenced Republicans. And together, those two forces came within 7 votes of defunding the NSA's domestic bulk collection operations. And if we had that vote again today, we would win it. Because there's been sustained outcry since, and I think many of the members of Congress, particularly Democrats, who were carrying the Bush administration's water here because the Obama administration told them to, I think they've been hearing it from their constituents. And so I think that transpartisan resonance of a constitutional perspective against what I would describe as the corrupt interests of an establishment in bed with the national security establishment, that's ultimately the fault line that we're seeing emerge. And to see, for instance, Senators Ron Wyden, a Democrat from Oregon, and Rand Paul, a Republican from Kentucky, or Senator Patrick Leahy, a Democrat from Vermont, standing with James Sensenbrenner, the Republican from Wisconsin, who I mentioned, those are great indications of the resonance of these values across the partisan spectrum.
Well, it's nice to find an issue that's finally nonpartisan.
Yes, indeed.
Well, of course, we know the latest news. France and Germany, the NSA is spying on foreign leaders abroad. Do you think that Americans have to care about this as well, just as much as they have to care about the infringements of rights here in the United States?
Absolutely. I mean, the habit of our country on turning our allies into enemies is as much a concern to Americans, I think, as the abuses of our own individual privacy rights. Separate from either of those two things, I think, is a concern for democracy, because what the NSA's abuses ultimately threaten are not just the rights of hundreds of millions of Americans and our diplomatic relationships with other countries, but also the future of democracy in America itself. With this kind of pervasive surveillance, the right to dissent withers, and the relationship between dissent and democracy is crucial to remember. And I think that's ultimately what is driving a lot of the resistance to these authoritarian programs.
Absolutely. And lastly, I want to ask you, what's next after the rally? What are the next steps that are going to continue this momentum?
There'll be movements and coalitions emerging across the country to do everything from trying to deny the NSA access to essential facilities like water and electricity, to pulling state governments out of complicity with suspicionless surveillance by putting in place controls on local and state police agencies, which are following the NSA's lead. Measures, for instance, like restricting the uses of domestic surveillance drones or other military technology used for surveillance purposes. And that's just going to be in itself a tip of the iceberg. There'll be sustained lobbying, I think, of members of Congress, and I think we'll continue to see these issues be very visible to the president. I think there'll be issues in the 2016 presidential election and the run-up to it. And I hope very much that members of Congress continue to heed the ongoing controversy that's imploring them to finally please pay respect and honor their oaths of office. Absolutely. To defend the Constitution against all enemies, both foreign and, like the NSA, domestic.
Absolutely. Well, I really appreciate you coming on to share your insight. Shahid Buttar, Executive Director of the Bill of Rights Defense Committee. Thank you.
Thanks for having me.